Hello again, peeps. It is Stephanie Chad Bradley, and I'm going to read you the other story that I wrote, another story that I wrote on. It's a kid's book. The other one was more like young adult. This is a children's book that I wrote in 2004 as well, before Automation. Okay, so this one is called Lita'S Garden Journey. Paco loved to go out in the garden with his Tatarella. He called her Lita because most everyone called her Buelita for short, but his little mouth wouldn't let him get all of that out. At the start, when he was just 1 year old, she thought it was because he couldn't play the big kids' games. But even after he grew, he'd still follow her out to the garden, sometimes almost tripping her. Yes, her Paco was a little strange one. He'd wake up early, just like Lita, and walk out to the garden, never too far behind. He loved to dig the first hole of a row. He loved to put in the first seeds of a row. Lita always let him, for she could see no harm in it, none at all. And she would carry extra water with them during harvest time, even though it was cooler then, so that she could wash off his favorite fresh plants, and he would eat them even before they returned home. Gracias, Lita. Hold on a second, this thing is going into edit mode. Sorry. I don't know what's going to do that. Oh, good girl. Where is it? Okay. Alright. Gracias, Lita. Many times, the big kids would come home from school with trinkets and toys. They'd earned them from school for best behavior, or quickest answers, or most helpful, or first finished. Not the same kid would win a reward, but every kid in the village won at least a couple of toys each year. And because they had to pass by the garden to get to school, Paco always heard them or saw them happy and proud of their new trinket or toy. So when he was 3 years old, he asked Lita when he could get a reward too. Lita said, "You will soon be old enough to go to school too, Paco." Paco said, "Will it be a long time? How long is soon, Lita?" So that very day, Lita made Paco his very own hat to protect him from the sun when they would walk to the garden together. So with his own little hat, he would walk the whole way. Before, she would have to tie him to her back, sometimes, especially when the sun was very hot. Her hat would shield both of them. So as he grew bigger and bigger, taller and taller, she'd make his hat wider and wider. One day, Paco asked Lita if she could weave seeds into his hat. Of course, she said, for she could see no harm in it, no harm at all. Everyone else in the village said it was a waste of good seed, but not Lita. She loved him so much and was glad to teach him about each seed and let him remember them with his hat. She even put different seeds each time she added a row to his hat to make it wider. Paco loved his reward, and sometimes he would play with it, but most times he kept it safe for his garden journeys with Lita. Besides, when he got old enough to go to school, he thought the teacher would give him trinkets and toy rewards to play. But Paco never received any trinket or toy reward from any of his teachers. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, There would always be someone else who behaved just a little bit better, or answered just a little bit quicker, or helped just a little bit more, or who finished just a little bit earlier than he did. But Paco always did his best, just in case. One day, as Lita was returning home from the garden, Paco was running home from school in tears and bumped into Lita's tiny but strong legs. She had his hat draped behind her. She hugged him, wiped away his tears, and took his hat and put it on his little head and told him, "It's okay, Mito. Your hat will be your reward." And he beamed with a big smile as Lita pulled out one of his favorite vegetables, already washed and ready to eat. Paco hadn't noticed it, but Lita always kept his garden hat with her, and always kept one of his favorite vegetables or fruits prepped for eating. Now that he went to school and played with the other kids of the village, she never knew when he'd have enough time or energy to make the early morning garden journey. I'll read that sentence again. Now that he went to school and played with the other kids of the village, she never knew when he'd have enough time or energy to make the early morning garden journey. She'd miss Paco walking with her. Everybody kept telling her, Lita, you don't have to keep gardening anymore. We go to the supermarket. Lita, you can rest now." It surprised Lita how everyone in the village could so easily tell her these things. Amazing how no one understood. For a time, she thought Paco was the only one who understood, and she was right, but it just didn't feel like it now because he was busy doing other things. One day at school, one of his friends, Martina, started to cry. The teacher asked everyone to be extra nice to her because her abuela had died and Martina missed having her around. She used to be the only one at home when Martina would get home from school. Paco thought about not having Lita around anymore, and he almost started to cry too. That day, he finished his last assignment as quickly as he could. He was not even thinking about any trinket or toy reward, though. He ran all of the way home from school to the garden. He didn't see Lita's hat bobbing up and down between the rows like he usually did. His heart started beating even faster than it already had been from all of the running. He had heard his mom and dad at night whispering about how they hoped Lita wouldn't fall out in the garden one day. He ran down the row of chili peppers. No Lita. He ran down the row of tomatoes. No Lita. He ran down the row of corn. No Lita. He didn't want to yell out her name because he didn't want to scare her or to let her hear in his voice how afraid he was that she may have passed out. Oh, there she is. He found her at the end of the cucumber row. She'd set up a tent there where she'd take a nap before returning home. She was inside the tent, sleeping so soundly that Paco's heart almost jumped through his ribs. But just then he saw her chest rise and fall and rise. He entered the tent and sat by Lita's feet. He found one of his favorite eats. Lita had put it aside, but she hadn't washed it yet. He washed it, like he'd seen her do through the years, for himself. He used his garden journey hat and filled it with water. The excellent weaving and special amber applique that Lita used to make it made it waterproof but breathable. He let the tomato soak for a while, scrubbing and bouncing it up and down inside of the water. His mouth watered in anticipation of his first bite. He carefully chucked the water out of his hat and outside the tent, making sure the water landed on a plant for good use. He bit into the fresh tomato as he placed his garden journey hat back on his head. He thought, how refreshing, both the delicious fresh tomato and the coolness of the damp hat. Que milagro. Take a little tiny seed, plus steady care, and voila, such a beautiful and delicious provision from the earth. He didn't leave any part of the tomato to throw away. He ate it all. He licked his lips and teeth as he lay back waiting for Lita to awaken, not wanting to disturb her rest. As the sun descended and the coolness of the air set in, he woke up with a start. He didn't know where he was. Oh yeah, he thought, Lita's napping and we're in the tent. Just as he leaned forward, so did she. He was relieved. She smiled wide and brightly when she saw Paco. Then he noticed her smile change into a look of worry. Nenito, ¿qué haces aquí? She reached out for him, held him next to her, and hugged him tight. What's wrong? Why have you been crying? Paco thought he had held back all of his tears. She could see the dried stains from the tears that had escaped down his face, along his cheeks. He told her about his friend at school whose grandma had died. He asked her, Lita, promise me you'll never die. Promise me you'll never leave me. Well, now I'll tell you what. You can only have one or the other. So which will it be? Asked Lita. Paco thought about this. He decided, please never leave me, Lita, and hugged her very, very tight. That, she said, is no problem, Paco. No problem at all, as she kissed the top of his forehead. Come on, let's go. He held her hand tightly, too, all the way home, since it was already getting quite dark. They didn't do any more harvesting on the way back. As years went by, Paco grew bigger and bigger, taller and taller, stronger and stronger. He still never won any rewards at school, but he always did his best, just in case, to give himself a chance. And because he knew Lita would ask him how his day had been, and he'd say, fine, but no reward, and she'd say, that's okay, mijito, your hat will be your reward. And as she hugged him tight and kissed the top of his she kissed the top of his forehead. He had to bend down now in order for her to reach it. His hat was really, really wide now. He was growing so fast that Lita had to add on 2 rows instead of just 1 every year, just to keep up. Paco still loved his hat very much. They'd already used up every type of seed of his favorite fruits and vegetables several times over. He loved the shadows the hat created around him and on his shirt and pants as he worked in the garden with Lita. Nowadays, he spent lots of time in the garden with Lita, just like he did before he'd started school. All of his friends wondered why he preferred to be in the garden so often instead of playing. They tried to convince him that he'll have to work hard, probably most of his grown-up life, so he should just play for now. Paco was amazed at how little they understood him. Didn't they know that for him, tending garden was fun? Paco had noticed that as he grew taller and taller, bigger and bigger, stronger and stronger, Lita seemed to grow smaller and smaller, shorter and shorter, weaker and weaker. And he began to wonder if she'd really be able to keep her promise. He made sure to enjoy every moment with her. But years and years went by, and Lita, slower, shorter, and weaker, still managed to do a lot of work in the garden, no matter how often the villagers begged her to rest. They even got Paco to try to talk her into letting him do all of the work, just only be there with him in the garden, if she wanted to, but to not work. Lita explained to Paco, Mijito, it's harder to start up again than it is to keep going. Paco didn't fully understand, but that was okay because he only wanted Lita to be happy, and whatever he had to do to see to it, he would. So even though it took him twice as long to finish gardening chores with Lita than if he'd worked alone, he didn't mind. Besides, it meant more time spent together for them. Many times his friend Martina would go with them to the garden. They understood each other even better after she shared with him how she felt about her grandma, the one who had died. And now, being with Lita was like having her own grandma around again. Plus, she was curious to know how Lita was going to keep her promise to never leave Paco. She didn't think that that was possible and was worried about how Paco would react if she died one day while they were out in the garden by themselves. Lita, though weaker in body, was still very strong in heart and mind. Paco and Martina hoped to be strong like her and live long and busy lives too. Lita now made rolls in the hats of Paco and Martina and their 3 children, Lita, 6, Paquito, 5, and Meta, 3 years old. They all loved their hats very much, but especially Meta. She would always try to talk Grandma Lita into making another row for her hat, even if it wasn't her time yet. Grandma Lita would give her a big hug and kiss and say, "I'll tell you what, instead of a row, I'll add more seeds for you." And Meta would beam happily and would show her new hat to anyone who'd bend down and listen. Meta is the one also who loved to be in the garden. No matter what else was going on, she wanted to be in the garden helping about with Grandma Lita and Paco. Now Paco would let Meta dig the first hole of a row and plant the first seeds of a row, and let her have the first bite of the first ripe tomato, also her favorite vegetable. Her delight in this reminded Paco of when he was a little boy in the garden with Grandma Lita. One day they were all on the garden journey. Grandma Lita and Lolita were in the tent taking a nap. And as they worked, suddenly a very quiet and thick stillness came over the garden, almost like when the sun goes down and night descends, calming down the whole village for the night. Except it was the middle of the day on a Saturday, and Paco had never felt such stillness at such a time. He decided to go and check on Grandma Lita in the tent. He didn't run this time, like he did when he was a little boy. He didn't want to alarm the others. He slowly pulled back the entrance to the tent. Lolita was holding Grandma Lita's hand and silently crying. Paco bent down and shut Grandma Lita's eyes as he kissed her on her forehead. "I wanted to go for help, but she asked me to stay with her. She said it was time." "It's okay, Lolita, you did fine," Paco said, and he hugged her sobbing little body as tears streamed down her face. Shortly after the great big funeral for Grandma Lita, Paco and Martina moved to the USA. Since Paco was born there when his dad was in the military, he had dual citizenship, so he could stay in Mexico or USA without question. Their parents wished them well and made them promise to return home often to visit. They promised, and before leaving, Paco gathered all of their hats, which Grandma Lita had made, to bury them in the garden, her hat in the center, his hat in the back, Martina's hat toward the front, Paquito's hat west near the tent, and Lolita's hat east toward the school. Everyone agreed to this hat burial ceremony in memory of Grandma Lita, except for Meta. She refused. She'd never been so determined about anything before. She said she would not leave Mexico if she couldn't bring with her the hat that Grandma Lita had made. Paco let her, as he could see no harm in it. It was just her way. Of course, when he was little, Paco had his ways too, he thought, like when he really believed that Grandma Lita would never die. After all of his life, she'd been the oldest person of the village, so who was to say that she had to leave at all, ever? She'd even outlived her husband and her son, which was Paco's great-grandpa, and her grandson, which was his grandpa. But he grew to understand, and just like when Lolita at Grandma Lita's funeral asked him if one day he'd be in a coffin too and leave them, he could honestly answer, "Yes, one day I'll be in a coffin. And no, I'll never leave you." Just like Grandma Lita had kept her promise to him. For he now understood that every time he saw their hats, he saw Grandma. And every time he saw the dew-covered garden in the early morning, he saw Grandma. And every time he or Martina kissed their children on the forehead, he saw Grandma. And every time any of them took a nap in the tent, he saw Grandma. And every time one of the school kids passed by the garden, joyful or sad about the trinket or toy rewards, he saw Grandma. And every time his kids asked if they could eat a fresh vegetable before going home from the garden, he saw Grandma. Yes, Grandma was always with him, and he'd always be with his loved ones too, as long as memories could know. So he made sure that every day, no matter what, he made joyful memories with his loved ones. And he did the same while they lived in the USA. But after just a few years of living there, their parents begged them to return to Mexico because the buses were on strike and there was no way to get to the stores and no family in the village had planted. They said that if he came back soon enough, they could have a good harvest of all sorts of food. So Paco and his family were all happy to leave the USA because even though they made a good living there and met many nice neighbors, they'd miss their family and friends of the village. So they packed lots of food, enough for every villager to eat for months, and lots of seeds and planting soil too. And they drove quickly all the way back home. Everyone was so happy to see them return that they followed their truck several yards through the village. Paco warmly greeted his mom and dad and everyone. They all ate together. And then he and his family headed to the garden. He saw where other villagers' gardens were stripped and not useful for gardening. He could see that they had not tended them well. But Grandma-Lita's garden, from the center out to the edges, was fertile and lively, seemingly hungry for more seed to grow. They straightened up the tent, and the others took a nap while Paco and Meta worked. The first thing they did was dig for his garden journey hat. They dug deep down. They couldn't find it. He knew he was searching in the right spot. Just as he was about to stop looking for it and just start working the rows to seed, he felt an intense calm. Total quietness had set over the garden, just like the time with Grandma Lita when she stopped working. At first, Paco was alarmed, thinking that he'd arrived home just in time for someone else's funeral. Then, just as suddenly, a gentle breeze whistled across Meta's garden journey hat, the one that she had insisted on keeping before they left. Now he understood what Grandma Lita had been saying all of that time. Your hat will be your reward. Since Grandma Lita had made all of the hats of natural straw and cornstalk leaves, and because she'd added lots of different seeds all around them, the garden had remained fertile and ready to perform its purpose. Grandma Lita had made the very thing that kept all alive, and again kept her promise to him that she'd always be with him. And he recalled again her gentle, loving voice saying, "It's okay, mijito. Your hat will be your reward." So that's the story of intergenerational interaction, and I think it's really cool if all homes had grandma. She was like great grandma, but grandparents, parents, kids in a garden. And the hat represents vocation. What is your talent, what is your passion, and that thing will always be your reward. Have an excellent St. Patty's Day weekend.